Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi everyone, this is Barney Levantino at Syosset Library.
And this is Lisa Hollander.
And we're here for another chapter of our podcast, Turn the Page. And we're thrilled today to have as our guest Tom Montalbano. And Tom, I have to tell you that when we first started talking about doing the podcasting, a lot of my focus here in the library is local history. And I said, you've got to be our first guest. So here you are, and we're thrilled to have you. So welcome, Tom.
Thank you. I'm honored.
For those of you who are not aware of who Tom is a local resident, lifelong resident, and an author and a historian, and we're going to now bounce it over to you and start telling us about how you became the chronicler of Syosset.
Okay. Interestingly, the last time I was down here, I believe I was sitting in, it was a little bit different, but we were recording old people from Syosset, doing an oral history program with Isabel Goldenkopf, who was the local history librarian at the time. And I was in my late 20s, I suppose, and sitting here with a head full of rock and roll hair, interviewing these people who were probably 50 at the time, and thinking how old they were and telling these old stories from the early 1900s. And now I'm the old guy sitting in the chair. And Do you want to start with that?
Yeah, we can talk about that. That goes back. That was early in the 90s, wasn't it?
That was 1990 and 91.
I was still in high school.
You were still in high school?
Syosset High School.
Yeah, Lisa is also a lifelong Syosset resident,
yes,
so
yes.
You guys share a connection.
Yeah, I was born in Syosset Hospital.
Okay.
In the 70s.
I was actually born in Brooklyn. Well, I guess we're going back a little bit further.
Yeah.
I was born in Brooklyn, but the family lived in Syosset. My father had bought an $18,000 corner house in the development known as Clearview Village, and I think he may have used a GI loan, like a lot of the people did at the time. So a lot of the people who came here originally were from Brooklyn and from Queens, and on the south side of Syosset had been all farms, and in the late 40s we had the golden nematode was a blight that came and destroyed all the farms down there. So as soon as that started happening, the developers came around, started knocking on farmers' doors, and do you want to sell? Do you want to sell? And everybody was like, absolutely. Where do I sign? So all that became brand new neighborhoods. The north had already been developed. The south was just up and coming. And everybody was from Brooklyn and Queens, and we all spoke like this. How you doing? Let's go to the park, get a piece of pizza. But there wasn't much connection with the town itself, because everyone had come from somewhere else. There wasn't an old man down the block that you're saying, go ask Fred, he knows everything, he's been here forever. So we kind of, it was our own little world over there, and we kind of grew up not having a sense of place as people in the north of Syosset, I later learned, did. We moved out for a little while. My father got a brochure for a place called Rio Rancho in New Mexico, and I guess he had gotten tired of Syosset already, and went out there, and we saw that it was just a model house and a lot of desert around it, so we came back here and bought a house in North Syosset, and it was quite different. On the south, we used to go out in the morning at like 8 o'clock in the morning. You'd just leave the house, you'd go play with your friends in the park, and you'd be gone all day, and you'd come home for dinner, where you been,
Yeah, like that's how we grew up on Long Island. We'd leave in the morning and come home at dinner, and somewhere along the way, somebody's mom would give you lunch.
There you go. By 10 years old, we were taking our bicycles and riding on the sidewalks to Roosevelt Field, which is a big schlep from here.
Yes.
Schlep was a Long Island word, by the way.
You're talking north and south. Like, for people that are not familiar with the area, what's in your mind, the geographical boundary?
Would you say Jericho?
Jericho Turnpike was always the dividing point. Yeah. We even had a South and a North Syosset Little League.
Yes, I remember that.
Bitter rivals in those days. In the South, again, I would say you didn't really have that sense of a community. But when I moved here, first we moved to Split Rock Road, and the first thing I remember is seeing a deer run across the road and hearing chickens clucking at night coming from a neighbor's yard. And this was like, where did we move? What are we doing here? But as I started to meet people, I noticed that there were people who had been here for generations. And I went to school, and there was the Williams family and the Kennedy family. And they'd all been here for 3-4 generations, and there was really a feeling like they had roots, deep here. And that was maybe the beginning of a feeling of community for me. And I tried to get involved in it in a lot of different ways. And finally, it wasn't cool in high school really to be a historian or to be into that. And the way we learned history in those days, excuse me, they never really brought it home. So you studied the Revolutionary War, and it was always something that was happening someplace else. It happened in Virginia or Boston. And you never really realized that it was happening here, even though we have Raynham Hall and Oyster Bay and all kinds of landmarks here, of big points in history. So when, I'm moving ahead again, when the library announced that it was going to do an oral history program here, I jumped on it. I had some experience with audio, and I was a musician, and I volunteered to record the interviews. And I kind of thought that I saw they had equipment that wasn't so great at the time, and I said, let's do this right and make sure that it's around. And so I dragged all this stuff. In those days, today we're recording here for anyone who's not listening on a box that's the size of like a
old cassette
electric
tape.
razor or something. But in those days, I dragged in a whole room full of equipment and sat here with headphones and big microphones and started listening to people speak. And not only were they weren't just talking about themselves so much, but they were talking about people who had been here that I'd kind of read about. Like we had the big estates in Syosset and Mutton Town. These were people who were historical figures who had bought these mansions in the area. And I'd only read about them as if, again, they lived on Mars or something. But they're saying, Jimmy Burden, that guy was crazy. They used to have these parties at the house, and they would drive the cars into the swimming pool. And all these people from the Great Gatsby and all.
That's exactly what I was just thinking, Gatsby.
They came to life. They were real people. Suddenly.
Fox hunts through town and all of that.
They would talk about the fox hunts where they would blow the whistle, and all the kids would have to get off the street because the dogs were coming through. And it was like, wow, this is really like a place that you would have read about in an old book. And they would talk about shopkeepers. You'd go into the stores, and the guy would take you around the store and grab things and put them in the bag and measure your butter and your cheese and all. And it was a completely different thing. And I just kind of, at that point, I think I was just hooked. They made history real for me. So I got very interested at that point.
Yeah, that program that you guys did, the Oral History Project, for years we had it on cassettes here, and then a couple of years ago we actually transferred it to DVD, and we've shown it a bunch of times, and people still love it. They clamor for it every time we show it. They come down, and we added there's images now that are attached to it where you were involved with in creating the audiovisual program.
Well, there were two components of it. There were the interviews. We interviewed about 15 or 20 people and then took sound bites and did a slideshow. It was an automated slideshow called the Syoshan Story.
And that's what we now have on DVD. And people still come in. They check it out and they love it.
Yeah, well, picture that when we first did it, they did 2 showings at the library, I think a week apart, and they had to do 2 each day. So because the people were just lined up outside the library to see this, it was an automated slideshow. It moved by itself. It had music and sound effects, and people just loved it at that time. I don't think it's translated well to DVD.
And actually, it works out okay because we've shown it, as I said, a couple of times when we do local history programs, and it flows nicely. It works great, and we tacked on at the end of it on the DVD the film of the fox hunting from the 20s.
Okay.
So people love that too.
Yeah, and these were things that the people who we did the interviews with. I'm saying we because I was basically the audio engineer, but Isabel Goldenkopf was from Port Washington, I believe. She was not from here, and she would start out asking questions. You didn't always know, so I'd be passing notes to her, like, ask them about da. So I've kind of, I apologize, but I've kind of made it my own, like it was a we thing. But anyway, so where were we? We were talking about the Syosset Story,
right?
The video. The quotes from the people that are in the actual video are just, some of them are just priceless. People tell stories. When you take just a little piece where they would tell you a story about something that happened 100 years earlier that they heard from their grandparent, and it was just great to listen to. And then when we did the showings, people who had done the interviews showed up, and their families showed up, and it was just like the conversation never ended at the end. So It's one of those things I always felt good about, and I wanted to do more after that. So I guess we can move along, and we'll probably get into those.
Yeah, well, that led to you, again, as I said, you're our go-to guy. When people come in asking us questions about what happened in Syosset way back when, we send them oftentimes to your book. And how'd the book come about?
The book, I think you mean
the Syosset Story,
okay.
Yeah.
That wasn't even the first one, because right after the Syosset Story that we did here, I stayed involved with all the people we had spoken to, and I used to see them in town, and we'd talk, and they started talking about the railroad. And I got really interested in the Syosset Railroad Station as the center of the downtown area, and went back and started just reading up on the railroad. And there were people who had kept records and photographs, and I would go out to Stony Brook, all over the place, and decided I wanted to do a piece just on the railroad. And it turns out that the railroad was basically the beginning of the downtown area. I mean, before that it was all farms. Can we get into that? Can we?
Sure.
Yeah.
It was all farms, and there was really no reason for farmers to do any kind of marketing outside of Syosset. They would trade with each other, and that everybody kind of could sustain themselves with what they grew or raised on the farm.
And they grew mostly potatoes?
Potatoes came a little bit later. It was corn, it was cabbage, it was that type of thing. Potatoes came a little bit later because there was the Irish immigration here. There was the Irish potato blight in the mid-1800s. And when the Irish came over, they had this hunger for potatoes, and they brought it with them. And the local farmers discovered potatoes, and they realized that they could actually transport these things. It wasn't like a head of lettuce that if you didn't get it to where it was going within a day or so, it would rot, and that was the end of it. So a potato could sit on a truck or whatever for weeks. So it was perfect when the train came along. And I'll back up and give you the train story. The Long Island Railroad had made its way across Long Island in 1834 is when they started building that. The idea was to build a route from Brooklyn or Manhattan up to Boston. And they couldn't do it along the Connecticut coastline because it was too rocky and hilly. So they decided, let's go through this piece of land here where nobody lives, no one's going to bother us. We'll just run the track right through the middle, and if they ask any questions, then we'll deal with it. And they ran it through. It went all the way out to Greenport. It reached there by 1844. And so now anybody could transport farm goods or anything that they were selling from Brooklyn to Greenport, Long Island, then take a ferry across to Stonington, Connecticut, and then take another train up to Boston, and they could get their goods. We were still trading with England at that time. A lot of things were going overseas. So it kind of opened up new markets for farmers, and suddenly everybody wanted a piece of this railroad. The Jones family, which they're all over Long Island, but there was in Cold Spring Harbor, they had a booming whale oil business going.
The Whaling Museum.
Well, the Whaling Museum, right? So their closest train station to them was Hicksville, which was 1837, I believe, opened in Hicksville. So in order to get anything onto the railroad, they had to take horse and buggy, over to Hicksville and get it there, get it on the train, and get back in the dark and the whole thing. So they were kind of a money family. And the whale oil industry was kind of starting to wane a little bit because there were other forms of energy coming in. They decided, the only way we're going to survive is we're going to cut our expenses. We're going to bring the railroad from Hicksville into Cold Spring Harbor. And they got a whole bunch of their wealthy friends together and said, give us some money. We're going to do this, and it'll help you. It'll help us. They started building. They got as far as Syosset in July of 1854. And all of a sudden they realized, wait a second, these hills are too big. We can't, they were right beyond Syosset. You have what they call the West Hills. Right. And it was just, they couldn't get through it any further. So they stopped right there. And Syosset was now the end of the line. So, and it wasn't called Syosset. I've been saying Syosset all along. At the time it was called Eastwoods, was the name that was originally used here in Syosset. So, all of a sudden now people are like, what do we do? If we can use the train, we can run the train this far, why don't we make Syosset the terminus of the line for this, for now? And suddenly all the farmers from around the area were coming in with their horses and wagons and bringing goods to Syosset to ship them out. And in those days, getting here by horse and wagon was not like getting in your car and you can do it any time of day and come back. It was a big hike to get up hills. Like they would come from East Norwich, they'd come from Oyster Bay, Huntington, and at the end of the day it would be dark and they'd have to have a place to stay. So they would come into Syosset and drop off the goods, and it would be like, all right, where's the hotel? So now all of a sudden you had a hotel open in Syosset. And then you had another hotel open, but they had to also eat when they got there. So there'd be a restaurant, there'd be a bar, and everybody drank liquor in those days because you didn't have pure water. So the saloons became a big thing in Syosset as well. You also had stagecoaches would spring up all over. We had a couple of stagecoach services, would take people from Cold Spring Harbor, from Huntington, from Oyster Bay into Syosset. And it became like this booming little area over here. Where it had just been wheat fields, and they used to call it buckwheat. It was kind of a derogatory thing. I don't know why it was, because we had a lot of buckwheat fieds. Did you want to ask a question?
No, keep going. This is fascinating.
It is very.
I don't know how long people want to just hear me go on. The railroad actually had a lot to do with the name. I mentioned that it was originally Eastwoods. It was part of the Robert Williams purchase of 1648. He had bought a swath of land from Punyapan, he was the leader of the Mutton Indians at that point, for some cloth and whatever it was, beads and they didn't really have currency at that point, but that included part of Jericho, Woodbury, and Syosset. And they actually called this Eastwoods, and there's a Southwoods. We have a Southwoods Middle School, so that area was actually called Southwoods. And they had different, regional names for the different areas. But it never really mattered what you called it, because there wasn't really mail service, and there wasn't really any reason to have a name for a town, except you'd get a letter from overseas or from family someplace. It would be usually addressed to Oyster Bay. So there was a point. I did some research with John Hammond, who's the town of Oyster Bay historian, about the origin of the name Syosset. People always assumed that it was based on this Indian word Syosset, and myself included.
Is that between the trees? Is that what it was always?
Place in the pines.
Place in the pines.
And it turns out it was the original name for Port Jefferson was Syosset. I even put this in the book we're talking about, The Images of America, Syosset, because you write what you know at the time, actually. But since then, I've done research with John Hammond, who's just an amazing, he's the town historian, he's just an encyclopedia of all these things. And we found this old captain's log. If you go back to the 1600s, the Europeans came over, the Dutch and the English. There were a lot of disputes over who owned Long Island. And you can see how it happened, because the Indians, the Native Americans at the time, we tend to think that we just, bulldozed them into selling property. They were kind of shrewd, because there are actually records of them selling a piece of property in the morning to the English, and then selling the same piece of property in the afternoon to them. They would say, like, yeah, you want to buy it? Yeah, give me some cigars, and then the Dutch would come in the afternoon. Yeah, you want it? Sure. They didn't have a concept of land ownership. So to them, sure, it's yours. You can have it. And then eventually, we told them they had to get off, and that's when problems began there. But earlier than that, the Dutch and the English disputed this area called, which we now know as Oyster Bay. And we're talking about the harbor in Oyster Bay and the actual town. Right. So the Dutch had a name for it that was named after, it was their word for sheriff, which, if you say it in Dutch, it spelled, the earliest English translations of this captain's log spell it Schouts. And if you ask a Dutch person to pronounce that, it comes out like Schouts. It's harder than Hebrew to say it. So it sounds. So over the years, this log was rewritten, was translated into English histories of the area, because the winner, of course, gets to tell the story later. And we watched over 200 years. It went from this word Schouts to a spelling where it says that Captain Tienhoven sent ships into Syosset's Bay. It's spelled Siocits Bay. And I guess if you're an Englishman, that's probably the best spelling you can come up with for, So this was around 1840. This came out in a history of New Amsterdam, and it was with that spelling. 1846, the people of Oyster Bay, meaning the hamlet that we know now, had gotten a little bit tired of their name. And there was also some problems with the mail because there was Oyster Bay up in the north, and the area we now know as Massapequa was South Oyster Bay.
Right.
So mail would be going back and forth, and I didn't get my birthday card. Right? It must have gone to South Oyster Bay. So they said a group of residents got together and decided they were going to change the name. And there was kind of at the time, a lot of Long Island towns were changing their names to reflect the Indian heritage. Of course, you had like Montaukett and all these, and they were going back to the earliest records they could find of Indian names. Somebody, and there's a bit of speculation here but there were other documents where this name they started spelling this name as Syosset. But somebody decided that this is what the Dutch called it. It must be based on an Indian name. It sounds Indian, Syossets, Montaukett, Pawtucket, and all that. So they decided they were going to change the name of Oyster Bay Hamlet to Syosset, and the spelling they used was the one we know now, Syosset. And from 1846 to 1849, Oyster Bay was called Syosset.
Interesting.
And there are actually maps drawn up where you see the whole area's because Eastwoods was a little tiny dot on the map at the time, but Syosset was already the place where Town Hall was. The town of Oyster Bay began right from the beginning, where it is now. But that was the biggest town around here, and everyone knew it as Syosset. So the railroad comes through, and as I said, they stalled in this area called Eastwoods. They needed to put a name on the station now, and it probably, but of course this could change. In a couple of years we could find out something else. Looked at the map and saw Syosset. The way you name like Los Angeles Airport is in a place called, I think, Inwood, and they're never exactly where they are, but you name it after the closest big city. So from that point on, it was July 5th. It was around the opening of the railroad was July 3rd. They had a ceremony, I think it was July 5th, 1854. They named it Syosset, and all the newspapers said, Syosset, and they never used the word Eastwoods again. What I should have mentioned earlier was that in 1849 they changed the name of Oyster Bay back of Syosset.
I was about to ask you that. When did Oyster Bay become Oyster Bay?
They changed it back. There were some landowners that said they should have been consulted, and how could you do this without us? And they fought back and they changed it back. But the maps had already been drawn, and it was all over the place. Syosset. Businesses listed their addresses, Syosset. So that's how the railroad has a lot to do with with the naming of our little hamlet here. And by the way, there's no record in the town of Oyster Bay history of this because Syosset was never incorporated. So that's why it's only a hamlet. It's not considered a town or a village. And so if you go through all the town of Oyster Bay records, the earliest sighting of the name Syosset is in 1846, so it refers to Oyster Bay, Syosset. But there's no mention of the change of the name or...
That's probably why we don't really have an official anniversary of Syosset, because no one really knew when it was that all happened.
Well, it would be 1854.
Right.
1855, the Postal Service opened up a post office here, and they named it Syosset. In those days, a post office was in a general store usually, and the first one was in a general store belonged to Philetus Ketchum. You probably know the Ketchum name from all over Long Island. They were all over this area as well. He was a prominent store owner. He had a store. There's no real record of where the store was, except that it was right adjacent to the train station. And the original train station, if you know the area, it wasn't where it is now, but it was at, if you know where Willis Avenue crosses Underhill Boulevard, that used to continue. And you can see that it continues still, like you cross Underhill Boulevard. And Willis Avenue continues on toward Jackson Avenue. So there used to be a station right at that junction of what's now Railroad Avenue and Willis Avenue. It wasn't really a station. It was basically the general store was there selling tickets, and people just got on the train. The train was at street level in those days.
That was Ketchum's General Store.
That was Ketchum's General Store. It's the earliest one there's really record of. There was also a hotel by a gentleman named Peter Bell who had a hotel in Hicksville originally, and he decided to cash in on the railroad in Syosset and built one in that same area. That one, there was that was around, I guess what's now Walters Avenue. It goes, if you go along Willis, is Walters Avenue the one that comes out of?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So that would be at the far end of Walters Avenue, not the Jackson Avenue end. But that would have been where the original hotel was, and that's where people would come in. They would use the train, and they would stay at the hotel. They would buy their tickets or buy the newspaper or whatever in that store, and so the train later moved down the road. We can get to that.
What when did the Zero Wire? There was another, right? There was another station that was further closer to Hicksville, right?
That was what they called the Landia Station. It wasn't really a station. It was there was during the war year, during World War II years, which was the 40s, the 1940s. We suddenly had Syosset was filled with defense factories, and it went from downtown Syosset all the way out to what's now Robbins Lane and all the area around. There's I think it's called the Syosset Atrium off Jericho Turnpike.
Oh yes,
There's a big Grumman facility over there, and over on Robbins Lane, where I don't want to make a time bomb out of this, but right now in 2018. There's a Lifetime Fitness Center, and there's probably a name for the shopping center over there, but it's adjacent to the railroad tracks on the would be the west side of Robbins Lane. There was a factory owned by Fairchild Industries, and they made like radios and cameras for the military, and it was a big draw. People were coming out here from Queens to work here. I think they had a factory originally in Jamaica, and they wanted to get people out here to work. But people didn't really have cars if they lived in the city, so they said they lobbied the Long Island Railroad to build a station over there, and it was just basically a stop. It was just a flat platform. They called it Landia. That was, I want to say 1953. Sometimes these numbers are in my head, and sometimes they're not. But
yeah, no, it's funny. I don't think people realize the extent of the defense industry that was in this area at the time. And I go back to there's a photograph of I guess it was a World War II photo of the Syosset officials on top of the building with the binoculars and the Civil Air Patrol helmet, looking out, I guess, for German bombers.
Yeah. Well, that was on top of the roof of a building that now has. Well, it's the corner of, and I wish we had a map here because I'm drawing blanks, but it's a tall building. There's the big bank. Maybe this is Walters Avenue. It's the one just before you hit the triangle, the first triangle. There's a big brick building over there.
Yes, I know exactly what you're talking about.
What's the name of the street?
It's near the. You're thinking. I'm thinking of that area, but I can't remember what the name of it is.
So if you're heading north on Jackson Avenue, you're coming through town, and you hit the first big triangle. There's where Cold Spring Road goes off to the right, and you go towards Split Rock and Berry Hill. There's the first street on the left. There's a big brick building, and that had started out. That was. It was originally an auto repair shop, and what happened was there were Krebs and Schultz were kind of they were very well known people around Syosset eventually, but they had started a little station in what's the triangle? No, that's not it.
That's not it. Okay.
Barney's showing me a picture inside in the book, and it's not exactly the spot, but I think we might have given them a good idea.
Yes.
So they had started an auto repair shop in what's now the Triangle, where there's a big gas station. And when they started to expand, they decided they were going to move over across the street, and they started building this big brick building. It was going to be a shop where they sold DeSoto Plymouths. There was the other thing that was big in Syosset. They were selling automobiles when they were first popular, when the GIs were coming back from the war and were looking to get out beyond Syosset. But this was before that. They had the foresight to know that automobiles were going to be big, but just when they built this building, all of a sudden America got involved in World War II. And there was a company called REF that was training people to build, to do sheet metal work for airplanes and just military weaponry. They approached Krebs and Schultz. They said, all right, before you open, we'd like to rent this building. We want to use it. We need it for the war effort. And in those days, everyone wanted to be part of the war effort.
Right.
So they gave them the building, and that became the first defense factory right in downtown Syosset. So you had people pouring in and out of there all day long. And that,
Yeah, that's the building, right?
Okay. So that building also, the picture you're talking about, it's been seen in, I think, a couple of different books written about Syosset. There was a Syosset air lookout patrol or whatever. It was basically, I think it was kind of a political thing. If you were one of these people chosen to do it, you got your picture in the paper and all. But they would sit on top of the roof and they would look out at the sky, waiting for enemy planes. And it wasn't so far fetched because we had the defense factories in town. You had that, and you had a Grumman plant building up, and so we were really a target. And so even at night, they used to turn all the lights out in town. You couldn't have your lights on. You had blackouts after certain hours because they thought the enemy planes were just prowling the skies looking for targets. So that's where the picture was taken. Other defense, I think we mentioned Grumman, we mentioned Fairchild, but it was a very big business, and it also built the town up even more because you had people who came to work had to go to lunch someplace, and had to buy this and buy that. So all of a sudden you had shops opening up all around town. You had luncheonettes. You had what used to be a large hotel in the middle of town, which was originally owned by it was owned by a couple of people, but you may know it as the Boslett Hotel.
Yes.
The Boslets are still around Syosset. Most people refer to it by that name, but that became a restaurant, and it was the place for all the defense workers to go at lunchtime. And so picture this downtown area that's now kind of empty in 2018, just being a really booming little suburb for a long time based on defense.
This concludes part 1 of our discussion with Tom Montalbano. Part 2 of our discussion will air in the next chapter of Turn the Page.
Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Lisa.
And this is Barney, and welcome back to Turn the Page, the Syosset Library podcast. Tonight's chapter is the conclusion of our conversation with local author and historian Tom Montalbano.
Yeah, sometimes I talk about it like, the 80s or when I remember it, and I used to walk there and everyone's like, but there's nothing there. And I'm like, well, now there's nothing there, but back then there was still a little bit left.
Yeah. Well, as I said, I don't want to jump ahead too far, but I just finished a book on early commerce in downtown Syosset. And there was a golden era, the 50s, 60s, 70s, and when I moved to the north side, it was already the 1970s, and you could go down there and get lost for the day. There was a lot of things to do for kids, and we had a Friendly's right in downtown.
Yes.
It's been 100 different restaurants since
But now
then,
it's sticking.
but you could spend it was like it was like a 50s diner kind of place in those days where you just went after school, and there were a lot of places like that in downtown.
Yeah.
Syosset, so.
And I was saying, like we were talking about before, Syosset Suites, it was the place to go after, a concert or something. Everyone's like, wait, there was an ice cream shop downtown? Like, it just seems like another world at this point. Like, it's not even the same Syosset.
Well, we're hoping that'll come back someday. But we were getting toward, I just realized we were getting toward this book, the Images of America book. The Syosset Railroad book that I ultimately put together. In those days, you couldn't really self-publish, but you could go down to the stationery store and for $1 a page have something. So I think I made one or two of them. They cost me like $40 each. It was a 38-page book or something like that. So I think you have one copy and I have one copy. One of these days it'll be released. I think it tells a good story of how the railroad built the town. But after that. I got involved with a community service project because all this work with the library and the local history, and watching, especially watching the reactions of people to things like the Sioshan Story slideshow we did here. I felt like in the 90s, maybe late 80s, the town was starting to change, and people were moving in. We use the term bedroom community. People would move in, and they would come use the train. They would go home. They would go to sleep. They didn't know, how we're talking about. The street at the corner. Like these people, not a chance they would know the name of the street 2 blocks away. So I felt like I wanted to do something to kind of bring back that feeling of community. I started a youth group in town to try and give kids opportunities to do things like we had, and you're a lot younger than I am, when we were growing up, and we did community service projects. We'd go to soup kitchens and give out food, and we did a bicycle. We would collect used bicycles and restore them and then give them away, and we ended up giving away over 1,000 bicycles. And it was something that over the years there were over 500 kids involved, and I just felt like there was a hunger to be involved again, because kids were already starting with the phones and with the computers, and they weren't really socializing. And you had different cultures moving into town. In the 80s and 90s, you had people coming in from India and people coming in from Korea and Japan at the time, and China, and they would kind of go to school together, but then they would all separate, and that's the last they would see of each other. But this group brought together kids from all different. It was like a United Nations kind of group. Felt really good to do, and it built up to a feverish pitch at some point, and kind of wish it could have kept going, but sometimes things fall apart for financial reasons or whatever. And then the Chamber of Commerce. I'm sorry I'm taking too long to get there, but I'm trying to build up the suspense. I joined the Chamber of Commerce, went to their first meeting, and I saw that they were doing a similar type of thing. And I proposed that we do a holiday lighting event in downtown Syosset, and we did a concert, and I started bringing in local kids to do these concerts. And they were all efforts to just, to get the town...
Foster a sense of community.
To foster it, thank you.
The way it was before, yeah.
It would have taken me a while to come up with that. I think.
You would have got there.
Yeah, right. So anyway, I wanted to do something with all the pictures and things that I had been collecting from the people I had met doing the local history interviews here. I was starting to develop. I had this big box full of things, and I wanted to share them somehow. Didn't know how to do it. I didn't want to spend $40 a book again, So Richard Evers, who was the Hicksville historian, was just a brilliant guy, and again, an encyclopedia of Hicksville history and pretty much Long Island history. He approached me and said he had just done a book for this company called Arcadia. It was part of the series called Images of America, and all you gotta do is put some pictures together and put some captions, and you're done with it. So I figured it's a great way to get all these pictures out in case my house ever burns down, whatever, other people will have them. So I spent, I guess, probably 2 years actually putting it together, going around finding people, finding pictures, getting permission to put them out there, and found it was kind of difficult to tell the history of a town, of a hamlet, through just the photographs that you have. So sometimes we had to stretch it a little bit, and say that this was blue and it was red, really, But I got it all together like the spring of 2001 and sent it off to the publisher, and they just forgot about it. They said it'll probably come out in the fall sometime, and as the fall approached, they said September 13th is going to be the release of the book, and I started thinking about it again. And Borders was a big bookstore in Syosset.
I bought it from Borders.
Okay, Borders was on Jericho Turnpike, a huge store. It was one of those places where the whole community went to have coffee and sit.
Currently DSW.
DSW shoe store, and before that it was Lollipop Farm. If anybody's old enough,
Yes, I remember Play World
and By Right Toy Town, I think it was called. Anyway, so they contacted me, and they wanted to do a promotional event for the book, and I figured, great, we'll invite all the people around again. We'll make it a group discussion, and it was kind of exciting thinking about it. And all of a sudden, 9/11. I wake up that Tuesday morning, and everything just changed, and I completely lost interest in the book right away. It was I had already been doing, I was involved with the youth of the community, so I was like kind of doing triage with all the kids in the neighborhood, and just didn't want to hear about this book anymore. And a couple of days later, what interesting story I tell was that on September 13th, the day the book came out, and both of you may remember, the cloud, a brown cloud came from the World Trade Center, and it was covered, Syosset was completely this color, which color I remember as sepia, which was the actual color of the book.
Yeah.
So it was kind of eerie that the book was coming out. I knew it had this sepia cover on it, and everything in town was that color. All of a sudden you could smell it. It was on your clothing. And again, I didn't feel like doing anything. I'm sure nobody really did. But a few days, maybe a week or two after that, a couple of people had picked up the book, and I got phone calls. They were so excited about this thing. And I said, oh yeah, and I didn't want to get excited myself about it, but then it was led by more people, and then the Roslyn Savings Bank in town ordered 2,000 of them to give out at their grand opening, and it was sold out within the first run of the book was sold out within like a month or something, and then they put out a second issue, and people were, I guess, were just looking for some kind of nostalgia, because the present time was just so horrible, So everybody wanted to look backward, and it was the hottest ticket in town. For a lot of people were, trying to pre-order it, and they were asking me if I had one copy. I still only have one copy of it, and it went on to do very, very well. I hope that it kind of gave people a sense, I call it a sense of place, that Syosset was something worth having a book written about.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually very often get families that move into the area, and they come to the library looking for some information about the town. Again, they're looking to find out where they came and what this place is all about, and this is always the first source that we always send them to. This circulates a lot.
Yeah.
It's amazing how frequently it goes out, and people come in and they come back and say, what else do you have? And then we start getting them into the other things. But this is always a starting point for new families that move in. We always point them straight there, and we get nothing but rave reviews about the book. So yeah, you did a good job on that one.
Well, thank you. Ultimately, it sold more than 6,000 copies, and
that's got to be like a bestseller for arcade.
At the time, somebody said, you only need 8,000 to be on the New York Times bestseller list or something. Yeah, so they started asking for another one. I said, call my friend John. And I guess there's another book called Syosset, People and Places.
Yes.
Right? It's the same series, and John put together some other things, and I gave him some of my pictures. And it's a good book as well.
Yeah, it's a great book. Your book has a lot more text and in it. His book is really more the photos and captions, but you have a lot more textual information, and it's a different type of book. It's more informative, and his is more of a straight nostalgia trip, I think.
Well, John didn't live in Syosset for very long, and John is one of those people that caught the bug early, moved away very, very young, but never forgot about Syosset. And to this day, again, we're in 2018, he has a site called Syosset Scrapbook.
Oh, I love that. I was talking about that the other day.
It's my favorite website in the world.
I remember when it first came out, and I had, everyone had those slow dial-up, and it was like I had to wait for the oranges to load. It's so great.
That's right. And people keep adding to it. People keep sending in pictures, so it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so it's a nice thing that's out there as well. And but I felt with this that it wasn't. I think you said, I don't know, put this idea in my head, but I said it wasn't enough for me. I felt like I wanted to tell the story in more detail. And of course, in those days, you didn't have access. You didn't have the internet, really, so you didn't really have access to all the information that's out there now. And these days, you can go back, you can find old newspapers from the 1800s, and you can read, while it was actually happening, you say, all right, it's not just hearsay anymore. It's not just a story that someone told, and maybe I missed this detail of it, and I wish I could have put that in the book. And I started thinking about other books to do. And in what year was it?
I know the fire department kept you busy for quite a while.
The fire department was the next project. I got involved in a line of work where I was traveling for about 8 years, literally every day. So I was really not involved in Syosset for that amount of time. I decided at a certain point I had grandchildren and I wanted to be closer to them, so I gave that up. I moved back to Syosset. I took a job with the town of Oyster Bay and decided that I was going to feed my soul by getting back into Syosset history. So the first project, I'd always been just in awe of the fire department. We have an amazing fire department in Syosset, and it's an all-volunteer fire department so far. And I knew it was a big thing to tackle, but I wanted to do it. I wanted to get the story, and I wanted to get it right. And I knew their 100th anniversary was coming up, and I wanted to do that first 100 years and do it so thoroughly that the person who did the next 100 years could use half of it or whatever, you know. So I started that around 2008, and got a lot of information from a lot of different people, and had access to all the old newspapers. And the fire department was founded in 2015. Before that, for hundreds of years, you basically just had neighbors. You depended on your neighbors being good ones, because if they smelled smoke, they would come over to your house with their water bucket, and they would get together a bunch of people. They would start pulling water out of a well and try to douse the flames with that. Eventually, we talked earlier a little bit about the estates in town. 1899, they formed Nassau County, and this became like an area that you wanted to be if you were one of the beautiful people. And they started building estates, magnificent houses here along Mutton Town Road, Split Rock Road, and these people weren't going to put out their own fires. So they started demanding that, and they started demanding it of the people who were building the houses, the real estate people who were selling them the property. They're the ones who eventually formed the Syosset Fire Department. Albert Bayless was one of those people. He was a big landowner, and he was selling a lot of property to these estate owners. And they formed this in 1915. It was kind of a crude little department. It's eventually just built into we could do another whole show on that if you ever wanted to, but it's one of the top fire departments in the country from what I understand and what you can see, just looking at the equipment and the training. And so that came out. They put out 500 copies of that at their parade. And I'm telling you the story just to show how Syosset has kind of changed over the years. I've now met maybe 2 people who have read it. And these were all over the place. And I thought...
3, I read it.
You read it, okay. 3. That's good. Did you read it? No.
I didn't, but I didn't know it existed.
Okay.
That's my problem.
Well, it was one of they gave them out to everyone there. I was so proud of this book, and I still am, but... people moving into Syosset now were a lot of people are coming from cultures that they have 5,000 year histories, and to read about something that's 100 years old is like I'll get around to that. It's like reading last month's issue of Time magazine or something, so that kind of it was a little bit of a disappointment, but I still feel like there are things that I wanted to get out, and I still feel like there's kind of a hunger from some people. A lot of the originals who we interviewed, and
actually, the fire department anniversary came up, and we did a program here at the library to kind of commemorate it. A lot of the material, I know I spoke to you about it beforehand. A lot of material in your book we used in setting up the program and doing the slideshow. We had a great response to. We actually had a lot of people come down, and a lot of people asking a lot of questions about the fire department, and we again pointed them to your summary book, and people still are interested. Again, it's. I usually get the same crowd coming back and forth to the local history programs.
Quick story. One of Barney's first programs that he did here, he invited me to come and meet his group. And when I got here, I noticed that I was listed as the special guest speaker, and I had nothing prepared at all. And all of a sudden, I walk into a room, and I think there were 55 people.
There were people at the door that day. There were people at the door.
And it's like, and now here's Tom Monalbano, and I'm like, oh. And it was a nice group of people. They seemed genuinely interested.
Yeah.
A lot of those people, I think, and I know I got to know some of them later on. A lot of them have passed away or have moved out of the area. So the point I was making was that the audience for local history, I think, is kind of dwindling at this point. So I want to get as much out there as I can while there's still some kind of an audience for it. And if you want me to keep going, I guess.
Yeah, no, and you actually did a great job on that program that day, and I still get people asking when you're going to come back and do another one.
Oh, really?
So
okay.
We'll rope you in another day. I'll invite you down and won't tell you you're doing a program.
Anyway, so there was a little book somewhere in the middle of that. I mentioned that I work at the town of Oyster Bay, and if you ever want to talk about the estates, there are 3 of them that are still left that people can actually see. One of them is in the park where my building is. It's the Webb Tinker Mansion.
Where I went to nursery school.
You went to yeah. So you were part of the town of Oyster Bay preschool program.
Yes, I was.
That was built for a great. Talk about it. Good.
There was a rocket ship in there, and let's just say I went to the top, but I didn't want to come down. I think it would be a hazard now if it was still around. It was in the playground. Yeah.
I have a photograph of that.
Do you? I haven't seen. I don't remember what it even looked like. I remember it being so big, but I'm sure it really wasn't that big.
It was tiny.
It wasn't really?
I saw a picture of it in a closet that was no bigger than like a coat closet.
Oh my God!
I think it was a little bit bigger. It was in half though. This was a rocket at the Syosset Community Park that all the kids, take me, could we go to the rocket? We'd beg our parents to go. You could climb up the middle. It had a hole probably about this big.
It was so small. That's what I remember. Yes.
Well, that's why I'm telling the story, because the last time I went through there, I got stuck in the hole. And,
well, that was the thing. I got to the top of it, and then I was scared to come down, but my mother couldn't get into it because she was, an adult. So I had to send other kids to kind of get me down.
A lot of people have memories of the park and of that mansion because it used to be open for. They used to have recreation night there. They used to have bands playing in there. This is a mansion that was built for a great grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was a railroad tycoon. His name was J. Watson Webb. James Watson Webb. He built the house with his wife, Electra Havemeyer. She was the heiress to the American sugar refining fortune, which is like the equivalent of Google or Microsoft today. Yeah. This was a weekend house. It was 222 acres and took in not only the park, what we know as the Syosset Park today, but the industrial park around a part of the Thompson Middle School.
Wow.
And it went down to Piquet Lane, down the other way. Wow. People call it Pickett's Lane.
Yeah.
And They lived there only on the weekends. It was just kind of a summer weekend type place. They were more interested. They were building a nicer house in Vermont, which is called Sherborne. It's still there now, and they do catering out there and all. But so they kind of got tired of it. They moved in 1914, 1915. By 1919, they decided it was too small. They didn't want it anymore, and they decided to sell it. So this guy Edward Tinker comes along. He's the chairman of Chase Securities. He bought 72 acres of it for $162,000. And that it included the mansion, it included a good portion of what's the park. Now, he eventually bought the whole thing, but most people know it as the Tinker Mansion. Mm-hmm. And he did the same thing with it. He lived there until he died in 1959, but it was the same idea. You could keep property in those days if you ran a little farm off it. You got a nice big tax break, so they ran a chicken farm out there, and they used to have a farm stand up on Jericho Turnpike. And across the way on Jericho Turnpike, if you want to, can we talk a little bit about the state? We're okay on time?
Absolutely.
And, across the way on Jericho Turnpike, you had what was the Bruce Mellon estate. Andrew Mellon was the Secretary of the Treasury during the Great Depression, actually. He still had a lot of money, but he bought this estate from Victor Morowitz, who was an attorney who had bought it from a farmer and built this beautiful, property there on the corner. It's on the corner of Southwoods Road and Jericho Turnpike. Andrew Mellon bought this for his daughter, Elijah. It was Ailsa, Ailsa, who was marrying David Bruce, who was a diplomat, and bought the property, built the beautiful mansion that's there now. They had servants all over the place. They had a collection of art there that I believe is in the Whitney or some large art museum now. And they used to have, again, over there, lavish parties all the time. They'd have ambassadors from all over the world, and they'd have presidents and kings and queens. And eventually they gave that up also. The third one is over on Mutton Town Road. It's people know it as the Mutton Town Country Club. I think it's called the Woodcrest Club now.
Yeah. Did it close?
The club?
I don't know. Yeah.
I think they're still there. It's a pretty well-attended club. But that was the son of Henry Burden, who had built a machine to build horseshoes, to stamp out horseshoes. And he did this right before the Civil War, when the Union Army was going to need a lot of horseshoes. So the guy made a real killing in those days. He passed the money down to his son James, who built this estate on Mutton Road, which you can still see the building is still there. But James was part of that the generation of children of the real wealthy who were just spending the money like crazy.
Right.
They would just throw it in the pool and burn it. And, eventually, all the fortunes of these people just disappeared, because they thought it was going to last forever. And if you meet one of the Burdens these days, they're regular people like us, trying to get through life, and they don't know where all the money went. But you can still see any of those mansions if you go onto the country club or go into the park, and it's a piece of history that it's good to still have around. So
it's really nice when a lot of other ones that you read about got knocked down at some point. Some of the older ones. I want to say there was something else, I think, on Mutton Road that was like a big mansion that got knocked down at some point.
You had, I don't know if has it been knocked down? Because there were a couple of houses along there that were...
there were a lot. A lot of them are gone.
Yeah.
The son of the one in Cold Spring Harbor, and I don't know why the name's not coming to me, the one up on the hill, the biggest house up in Cold Spring Harbor.
Not Comset, is it?
No. Okay. We'll leave that one alone. But he built an estate. His father had it's got a name that they do catering there now, and it was the Eastern Military Academy.
Oh, the Ohiga Castle.
Ohiga Castle.
Yes, yes.
Ohiga Castle was Otto Herman Kahn. That's why it was called. His son had built a big, kind of a mini version of that on Mutton Road. That may be what you're.
Yes, that's what I was.
So, anyways, I just said that because I ended up giving a verbal tour of the mansion in the park every day when I was there. People found out that I knew the history of it, and I wrote a little book on that. And it's just something else you'll probably have here in the library at some point. But
okay, you've been here pretty much all your life. So, from the time you grew up to now, what do you see as the biggest change in the community?
It goes back to what we discussed earlier, the sense of community. Again, when I moved to the north, I remember coming to the Memorial Day parade for the first time, and everybody in town was there.
I marched in it many years.
Yeah, and I eventually did also. I couldn't, every kid I knew from school was there, and all the parents were there, and every band, it seemed to go on for 3.5 hours or something in those days. It was something, today I do the audio for the parade, so I'm there at the beginning and I'm there at the end, and you look down the road waiting for the parade to come, and then, a half hour later it's all over already, but it's great that it's still going, but I kind of feel like people come out just because it's a nice day, and people don't really socialize there either. Used to also stay around town. You mentioned that there were a lot of places to go after. Now they come to the parade and they're gone. And I don't want to be a downer about it. I think it can probably come back, but I think everyone needs to really work at it. Again, there's so many different cultures here that don't really understand each other. It used to be, you had the Italians, they used to call, and some of the guys in the oral history used to call the area by Underhill Boulevard, you had Guinea Town and you had Irish Town. I'm sorry if that's what they said. So, so you had the Italians and you had the Irish over there, and they got along famously, in those days. Now you have people who don't speak the same language even, and you see them in the store and they're trying to talk to each other and it just doesn't quite work. So I guess the biggest change is that. Again, I think it could work. I'm not exactly sure how to do it. And I keep trying to do these little things to bring people together.
Yeah. I'll put you on the spot one last time here. If you got stopped in the street and somebody asked you, what's the wackiest Syosset history fact you can recall, what would you come up with?
Oh, okay. That's another book, by the way. How much more time do we have? Somewhere in the middle of all this, I started researching and writing about bizarre things that had happened in Syosset, a lot of them going back to the mid-1800s, and a lot of them have to do with alcohol. Because I don't know if I mentioned,
why not?
The reason, and you find out when you dig deep into these things, the reason people were always drunk in those days was that there was no pure water. So the only way to hydrate yourself was to drink something that had alcohol content. So you had cider, you had like what we call hard cider, I guess now, and you even had root beer that had some alcohol in it, and you'd go into, there's one story, there was a hotel right on what's now the big triangle in the middle of town where I mentioned the road goes off to Cold Spring, and they had a saloon in there. And there's one story where some guys had an argument. Somebody had, called him a name or something like that. And this guy was a big, burly farmer, lived on Convent Road. And these two guys followed him home, and they beat him to death, like on what's now, I think it's 5th Place. If you do the measurements. Because it was just a block away from my house. And, every time I drive by there now, I think, the ghost of this guy is, lying on the corner or whatever. But that's one of, there were other stories where people went out to vote, and they talk about, in the trial, they talk about where they stopped to drink along the way. And by the end of the night, they're killing each other. The guy takes out a rifle and shoots the other guy, and that's the end of that. There are lots of stories like that. There was a farmer from Syosset on Jackson Avenue. And again, the name's not coming to me, but this will be in the forthcoming book. Who tried to assassinate Teddy Roosevelt. He was a guy was a little bit off. He was nuts, and he had these visions that Teddy Roosevelt wanted him to come and marry his daughter. And his daughter was kind of a, Teddy's daughter, Ethel.
It wasn't Alice?
Alice, I'm sorry. Alice was kind of a modern woman. She smoked cigars, and and this guy was madly in love with Alice. And he showed up in Oyster Bay, showed up at Teddy Roosevelt's house there. He was already the president, and he demanded that they let him through, that the president wants to see him, and he wants him to meet his daughter, and they kept turning him away. Eventually the guy he turned around, he came back, he just busted right through security and he went toward the house, and Teddy was out on the balcony there, and they got him, they brought him down and all, but this was this crazy farmer from Syosset who had decided that he was getting telepathic messages. And he was kind of he was describing basically what the Navy had just initiated with wireless communications. He said they were asking him, well, it's sort of like, they said, did he call you on the telephone? No, it's sort of a telephone without a wire. Anyway, so the most bizarre one, there are so many of them, and
well,
again,
we'll have to look forward to the next book for that one.
These are available on the Oyster Bay Historical Society website.
Yeah.
There's a whole series of these stories on there. If you want to read them, I'm as entertained by them as anybody. There are stories about someone who collected explosives at the Syosset train station and then went up, tried to blow up in Glen Cove, the millionaire out there. I think I wrote it down. J.P. Morgan.
Oh.
He tried to assassinate J.P. Morgan, and the person that I knew who was running the train station over here for years, all of a sudden he's in this story, and he tells the story of this guy showed up, he gave me this crazy name, and he picks up this big box. It turns out the guy was collecting explosives at the Syosset train station, and this was big stories in the New York Times and everything. There are stories of, if you go back to the old newspapers, if you go to there's a site called Suffolk County Historical Newspapers, and you look through the Long Islander. The Long Islander was started by Walt Whitman, and it was a local paper, and it was the only local paper, and there wasn't a lot of news, so they used to send people into Syosset and Woodbury and East Norwich and find out who was having tea with who, and all this stuff is in such detail over there. You can read stories just forever. You can get caught up in it for hours and hours, so highly recommend.
That actually sounds like fun.
It's a lot of fun until you realize that you haven't been to work in 3 days, or you haven't eaten.
Or you could do it while you're at work now.
Yeah. So.
Tom, thank you so much for coming down. We really appreciate it.
Yes.
It's been fascinating as always, and we look forward to talking to you again someday, and looking forward to your next works coming out. And I guess at this point, Lisa, shall we close up this chapter?
Yes, we will close this chapter of Turn the Page.
Thank you, everyone.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.